today I'm speaking to Norman Finkelstein about the war in Israel. Norman is a political scientist, pro-Palestinian activist, and author. And he has a new book coming out called Gaza's Gravediggers, which we're going to discuss in this episode. Just to quickly mention before we get into it, we had originally scheduled two separate debates, one with Norman and Jonathan Conricus, IDF's former spokesperson. Norman came on, Jonathan came on, and Jonathan did not come up. He did not turn up, and he only let me know 10 minutes after we were scheduled to debate. And then we also today, around an hour ago, we were scheduled to have a debate. Norman was scheduled to have a debate with Danny Ayalon, Israel's deputy foreign minister, and he also didn't turn up, although agreeing. So that's just to give a bit of a recap to understanding what's happening here. Norman, I'm going to go through some of the quotes in your introduction of your new book, Gaza's Gravedigger, and I've got some questions on them, and we can have that discussion.
Okay, just a couple of things. First of all, the fact that Mr. Conricus and Mr. Ayalon dropped out is par for the course. I was supposed to debate Benny Morris, the Israeli historian at Oxford, a couple of weeks ago. He dropped out at the last minute. He then conditioned appearing at Oxford on former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert being allowed to join him on the panel. Oxford contacted Ehud Olmert and veritably, not virtually, veritably begged him to be on, but he was categorical. He will not debate Norman Finkelstein. So the listener can infer what he or she wants from that. My inference is, without editorializing, truth is a powerful weapon. The second thing is the book, the introduction to my forthcoming book is the first draft is close to completion. Hopefully it'll be available in about 3 months' time. So don't start emailing me where can I get the book, because it's not yet complete. The first draft is almost complete.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's get started talking about it. So in the first page, you said, and I'm going to quote this, a UN Commission of Inquiry headed by a South Africa jurist and a self-described Zionist found in 2009 that the blockade plausibly constituted a crime against humanity. Now, a lot of Israelis will say, or people on that side will say, that the UN might say something, but the UN is anti-Israel. And they'll point to statistics such as that the United Nations Human Rights Council condemned Israel 104 times since 2006, and against Iran, Russia, North Korea, and everyone else combined, only 99 times. Or the other point, that the United Nations General Assembly has passed 141 times condemning Israel since 2015, double all the other condemnations in other countries combined. What do you say to that?
Well, the first thing I would say is that when the UN Commission of Inquiry was formed after Operation Cast Lead, which occurred in December 26 to January 7th, December 26, 2008 to January 17th, 2009, when the UN Commission of Inquiry was formed, the mandate for that commission was written by Richard Goldstone. Now, Richard Goldstone was an eminent South African jurist. He was Jewish, and by his own reckoning, he was a Zionist. So it's hard, and as I just said, he wrote the mandate. The UN Human Rights Council said to him, you write what you are going to investigate, and we will approve whatever you write. And that's what happened. And then Goldstone said, I couldn't very well refuse to serve on a commission where I myself wrote the mandate. Number two, the opinion that the blockade of Gaza is illegal under international law is shared by every international human rights and humanitarian organization. It's the opinion, the law bearing on a occupation is called the Fourth Geneva Convention. And what's called technically the term, the guardian of the Fourth Geneva Convention, is the International Committee of the Red Cross. And the International Committee of the Red Cross has consistently held since 2006 that the blockade of Gaza is illegal under international law.
Norman, I get that other international organizations have also said that, but about the point specifically, is the UN anti-Israel?
Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and so forth.
But about the point that I mentioned about, it seems like the UN is anti-Israel. From all those statistics that I mentioned, what would you say to that?
There's a reason for that. Because Israel ignores all UN resolutions. 95% of what you call all these resolutions is simply the UN repeating itself. How many times has the UN said the settlements are illegal? And how many times has Israel proceeded to keep building the settlements? How many times has the Security Council, not just the General Assembly, the Security Council ruled that the settlements are illegal under international law? Israel keeps building the settlements. And then they're condemned again, and condemned again, and condemned again. If Israel keeps breaking the law, why should it come as a surprise that the violations of the law, the breaches of the law, are persistently denounced by the UN? Take the case of the International Court of Justice. In January 2024, the UN issues the ICJ issues what are called provisional measures. Provisional or indicates. I have to use the technical jargon, or then somebody's going to come along and say, you don't know what you're talking about with the law. Well, actually, I know very well what I'm talking about. The ICJ indicates provisional measures. That's steps that Israel has to take because it's plausibly in violation of the Genocide Convention. So it says Israel has to admit humanitarian aid into Gaza. You know what Israel did? Israel actually, after the ICJ indicated its provisional measure, it reduced even more the amount of humanitarian aid being admitted to Gaza. Then the South Africa goes a second time before the ICJ for the same thing, to admit humanitarian aid to Gaza. Israel ignores it. ICJ then goes in March to the
I get what you're saying.
March,
that Israel,
and then it goes in May. It keeps going back and back and back and back because Israel is simply ignoring the orders of the supreme legal body in the world.
Okay, so that you're saying that the reason why there's so many condemnations is because Israel keep ignoring it. But if we look at all the other countries, for example, North Korea, they've got 25 million people in there living under a dictatorship, a horrible regime.
Hey, dictatorships are allowed in this world. That's not illegal, a dictatorship.
But North Korea isn't a very good place, is it?
Hey, you know what? It's not a good place. There are very few, well, I'll grant the Scandinavian countries. There are very few good places on the planet. Unfortunately, good places are not illegal under international law.
But with North Korea, you've got this. You live under a life of propaganda. You live under. It's not as if it's a free.
I never said it was free. I never said it was free. I said it's not a nice place to live. I have no doubt about that. If the U.S. lifted its sanctions on North Korea, it would probably be a bearable place to live. Like in Iran, it would be a bearable place to live. Is it my cup of tea? No. But guess what? You ready for this? My government isn't my cup of tea either.
But with North Korea,
my government has the most backward health system, not just among the industrialized countries, but probably in comparison, not probably, definitely, in comparison to places like Cuba. We have the most backward health system to the point. I mean, really, it's quite an astonishing thing. When the CEO of United Healthcare Insurance was shot, I would say about 80% of Americans thought he got what was coming to him. So our country isn't a great place either. The law says nothing about that. Israel happens to be guilty of several crimes which are covered by international law.
But so is North Korea. And they do very similar. They bring people up on propaganda. They brainwash people.
I'm not going to get into an argument about North Korea. A, you didn't have me on to speak about North Korea. And B, I just don't know much about it. In my youth, I was a Maoist, and the head of state of North Korea was a fellow named Kim Il-sung, who we were supposed to support because we were Maoists. I read a few books on the subject long before you were born, probably twice the time before you were born. So I'm not going to speak on North Korea. What I would say, because we should be serious, and I think you try to be serious, you make an effort. What we should be talking about is the following fact. By every metric, every available metric, Israel's crimes in Gaza are in a class all their own. There's nothing like it, not just in the 21st century. Even by some metrics, like tonnage of bombs dropped, density of destruction, there's nothing like it going back to World War II. Israel has created an apocalypse in Gaza. And bear in mind where it chose to locate the apocalypse. An area 26 miles long, 5 miles wide, repeatedly described by witnesses, including Israel's former head of the National Security Council, repeatedly described as a concentration camp. Israel has created an apocalypse targeting a concentration camp, half of whose inmates are children. So, if there is outrage and indignation at what Israel is doing, and if for a period of time this outrage and indignation dominated news headlines, it's not because, in my opinion, the international community or the international public is anti-Semitic or prejudiced against Israel. The horror that it has inflicted in Gaza is simply unspeakable. I was reading the past couple of days the new Amnesty report on Gaza. It's 300 pages, 296 pages. And it alleges with voluminous documentation that Israel's committing genocide in Gaza, not in the dictionary definition of genocide, but the technical legal definition based on the Genocide Convention of 1948, Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. I then last night, after finishing the Amnesty report, without missing a beat, I then turned to Lee Mordecai's report documenting the genocide in Gaza. So it seems to me there's ample reason for the international community to give disproportionate attention at this particular moment, even though it's now dropped out of the news cycle because of Syria, to give disproportionate attention to the horror that's been inflicted on this God-forsaken people, who, as you know already from having read my introduction, have suffered in a concentration camp, judging by what neutral observers have said, and they were even referring to the period before Israel occupied Gaza, namely the period when it was under Egyptian administration, already back in the mid-1950s. That means 70 years. 70 years. These people have been living in a condition that has been persistently described by outside observers as a concentration camp. And now, as some people have put it, not without reason, the concentration camp since October 7th has turned into an extermination camp.
If you don't, we might get to that later, but if you don't mind, we've got limited time, so I just want to get into the next
You mentioned the question of North Korea. Let me just give you one statistic which I found quite astonishing. A new report was put out this week by this organization called Air Wars, AIRWARS. I think it's British-based. They pointed out that in the first 25 days of Israel's assault on Gaza, 1,900 children had been killed. In the darkest days of the Bashar regime, the darkest days, 2017, okay? The largest number of children killed for any 1 month during the darkest days of the Bashar regime was 239 versus 1,900 for 25 days. And then they point out, if you take the darkest year in Syria, 2017, the whole year, as many children were killed in Gaza in 25 days as were killed under Bashar al-Assad for the whole year 2017. It's an awesome, a breathtaking achievement what Israel has done to those God-forsaken people.
So the reason I brought up North Korea wasn't that we should have a whole debate on North Korea, but more as a comparison to say, there's between the Gaza and West Bank, there's 5 million people.
Right, I just made a comparison with Syria. Syria is in everyone's mind. Bashar was a butcher. Bashar was a monster. Bashar was this and Bashar was that. I'm not going to dissent. I'm not going to disagree. But I'm saying, look at the record. Compare what Israel did in 25 days, from October 7th to October 31st, to what Bashar did.
But the point is, why I'm comparing it to Russia is because of the UN, of how much they've condemned, not Russia, North Korea, how much they've condemned North Korea, which have 25 million people in, compared to Gaza and North, that's 2-3 million.
I'm not going to debate. Look, I have a very firm credo. No investigation, no right to speak. I've not studied it. I'm not going to talk about it.
Okay, so let's move on then. So another quote of your book was, Trapped in the vice of Israel's criminal blockade, Hamas desperately endeavored to carve out a path to normalcy. It tried diplomacy. How did they try diplomacy?
Well, I give one quote from an extensive record. In fact, there were numerous peace initiatives by Hamas trying to feel out how to solve the conflict according to international law. I'm not saying that Hamas suddenly became converted to international law. It's one of the realities of power. So let's just take a comparative example. The PLO, as you know, the Palestine, or you might not know because you're too young and I'm too old. The Palestine Liberation Organization was known as a terrorist organization in the West. Come around the early 1970s, the PLO starts gaining a certain degree of respectability among international institutions. In 1974, the head of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, he makes a famous speech at the UN. It's called The Gun or the Olive Branch, in which he says, we're giving you a choice. By 1976, and it's been exhaustively documented at this point, by 1976, the PLO is on record supporting a two-state settlement along the June 1967 borders. Does that mean that Arafat suddenly became converted to international law or UN resolutions? No. It meant that once you become a principal player on the world stage, you cannot operate outside international law, or else you are marginalized.
So Hamas never said they want a two-state solution.
Allow me to finish. Hamas won the election in 2006. It was now a responsible political party in power. And at that point, Hamas sent out many feelers, just like the PLO in the 1970s, indicated it was ready to negotiate a settlement along the June 1967 borders. However, I don't have any stake in misrepresenting the facts. The international law says that the refugees from 1947 have a right to return. Now, it is correct that Hamas had not given up on the right of return, and it had a right not to give up on the right of return because that's the law. Amnesty International has said it. Palestinian refugees have the right to return. Human Rights Watch has said it. Palestinian refugees from 1948 have a right to return. So Hamas had indicated it was willing to settle the conflict along the terms of the two-state solution as enunciated in 1,000 by now UN resolutions, but it wasn't willing to give up on the right of return. And legally, it had the right to preserve the right of return. So I am perfectly willing to acknowledge, I said in what you read, would you mind reading it?
Sure, do you want, shall I read it again?
Yeah.
Trapped in the vice of Israel's criminal blockade, Hamas desperately endeavored to carve out a path to normalcy. It tried diplomacy.
Right, and now read what I said.
A 2009 study by a US government agency concluded that Hamas had been carefully and consciously adjusting its political program for years and had sent repeated signals that it might be ready to begin a process of coexisting with Israel.
Exactly. That's what I wrote. It said it was ready to begin a process of coexisting with Israel. It was never given a chance. I don't know what would have happened if they were at the negotiating table and whether or not Hamas would have budged on the question of the right of return. I don't know. It's a hard question for them. You know why? It's very simple. Their base is in Gaza, and 70% of the people in Gaza are refugees from 1948 or their children or their descendants. So it's very tough to give up on that right where your constituency is overwhelmingly the refugees. So it's a hard sell for them. I don't know what would have happened. What I do know for sure happened was nobody was willing to negotiate with them. Nobody was willing to give them a chance. In fact, what did Israel do? Israel then launched Operation Cast Lead. It launched Operation Cast Lead. A ceasefire had been signed with Gaza in June 2008. Even the Israeli sources state the ceasefire was holding up. Who broke the ceasefire? Israel broke the ceasefire on November 5th. Israel went into Gaza and killed a half dozen militants.
I want to go back to the diplomacy, just to keep on to the question diplomacy. You said that they said they adjusting their political program to potentially look at a peace solution. Did they ever say that they're willing to do a two-state solution?
There were many indications. I can't go through the whole record now. There was actually, I was surprised because after October 7th, some researchers who I work with started going through the whole record, and there was one after another indication by Hamas that it was willing to negotiate either a final solution to the question, a final settlement, or what they called a hudna, a 20-year HUDNA, a 20-year peace agreement with Israel. There were many possibilities, and if a person wants peace, what do? They test the possibilities to see what may and may not work. Israel or the United States and the United States were unwilling. They demanded complete capitulation by Hamas, which was the elected government. Remember, when the elections occurred in January 2006, Hamas didn't want to participate because it felt that the elections were part of what it called the Oslo process, and it didn't want to have anything to do with the Oslo Agreement of September 1993 because it thought that it was a capitulation by the Palestinians. It was exhorted to participate. And then it was President Bush who insisted on the elections. Because that was the era, again, you're way too young to remember, it was the era of what was called democracy promotion after the Gulf War. And so they were exhorted to participate, and they won the elections. So what? They're not allowed to take power after they won the election? And they were willing to negotiate. The record is clear on that. How the negotiations would have gone, I can't predict that.
So,
but
because
they were what?
Because just to look at it, because you mentioned they put out they're saying they're potentially willing to do peace. From an Israeli perspective, they see in Hamas's original charter where they say they want a one-state solution and they say they want to kill Jews. And
right, that charter was superseded already in 2017 by what was called a political document. You know, I'm sorry to have to age myself at your expense, but I remember, I am old enough to remember when they constantly tried to discredit all of the PLO's peace initiatives by saying, what about the PLO charter? What about the PLO charter? Well, you know what? Nobody in the PLO had even read that charter after so many years. The PLO charter was from 1968. Nobody even read it, but they kept dragging it out to make excuses for why not to negotiate. There was perfect grounds to negotiate. Did the Soviet Union have to renounce the Communist Manifesto in order to negotiate with the West? When there were the nuclear test ban treaties that were signed with the Soviet Union, and the intercontinental ballistic missile treaties, and the anti-missile treaties that were signed with the U.S., was a condition for signing them that they had to denounce the Communist Manifesto? Isn't that just a completely idiotic argument? No country is obliged to renounce its founding document. The question is whether they're willing to negotiate an end to the conflict.
Okay, so if we ignore the manifesto and even look at the other point that you mentioned, that they were willing to have some peace deal, and you mentioned that they said they're willing to have a two-state solution.
No, I said that. Yeah, correct.
Do you know any times? Because I've never heard them say that. Have you? Do you know any times or not?
What I'm going to simply do is, I don't have all the dates before me. I would refer people to my book on Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom, where I go through a very partial list where the PLO has indicated, excuse me, I feel I'm a throwback now because there was a period in my life where I had to argue the same question with the PLO, where Hamas indicates willingness to settle the conflict or agree to a hudna, a 20-year ceasefire with Israel on the basis of international law.
Okay, so let's move on then. So you mentioned later on, it's a whole paragraph, so I'm not going to really, I can read it if you want, but you mainly talk about what was it. I'll read it. So you wrote, what was Israel to do after 7th of October? Didn't it have a right to self-defense? So you posed that question on Israel.
That was the Piers Morgan probe. There were two Piers Morgan questions he has asked, because it's not over, for the last 14 months. Question number 1, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? Question number 2, what was Israel supposed to do? Didn't they have a right to self-defense?
So you're assuming he's going to read your book. So you wrote, consider this hypothetical. A woman is battered by her husband day in and day out for decades. She lets out a shriek of agony and despair. The neighbors ignore her pleas. She contacts the police. After conducting a thorough investigation, they file a devastating report, but it's left in a desk drawer to collect dust. One day, as he approaches her, the battered woman decides to take matters into her own hands and reaches for a knife and stabs him once, twice, 3 times. He grabs his pistol and shoots her dead in self-defense. The wife batterer would more likely than not be acquitted of murder in the court of law. But did he have the moral right to kill her? So if I'm right, it seems that you're saying that the people in Gaza have been abused for a long time. So you've got to expect some violence to come out.
Well, not quite. Mr. Hassell, unfortunately, we're pressed for time. But I have to be very clear about what I wrote. If the woman had not let out any screams, if she had not called the police, then I would say she had not exploited all the options that were available to her. And therefore, her case for stabbing the man would have been significantly weakened. But I was very careful to say she yelled and screamed in agony and torment, hoping to call attention to her battery. And those screams and torments were ignored. She then called the police. The police filed reports. You want to know what those reports are called? The Goldstone Report, the Mary McGowan Davis Report, the dozens of Amnesty International reports, the dozens of Human Rights Watch reports, all of them confirming that Israel's committing war crimes and plausibly crimes against humanity in Gaza. Hamas cooperated with all the commissions, whereas Israel refused to cooperate with the Goldstone Commission, for example, or the Goldstone Mission. Hamas cooperated. Now, Hamas knew that these missions would also indict them for war crimes. They knew that. There's a long record of these missions indicting Israel, but never forgetting to indict Hamas. And the same thing was done by Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Yes, he issued arrest warrants for Israel, Gallant and Netanyahu, but he also issued arrest warrants. But here's the difference. In every instance, Hamas, even though it knew it itself would be indicted, Hamas cooperated in the hope that maybe, just maybe, they would get justice for the people of Gaza. And each of those reports was exhaustive. I mean, we're talking about very large reports. The Goldstone report, I forgot now, but must have run into 300 pages. And totally ignored. So, you tried, in the metaphor of the woman, or the analogy of the woman, you tried screaming and yelling, you're ignored. You called the police, you're ignored. Then, I would say that woman exhausted all options short of stabbing the man, her batterer for 20 years, stabbing him in order to put an end for once and for all to her agony and her torment. And I do believe the man, even though more likely than not, it's called the castle doctrine, as in a man's home is his castle. The castle doctrine, the man would be acquitted in court in the grounds of self-defense. I believe he had no right to shoot her. He forfeited that right as a result of the 20 years of tormenting her. And she had a right to live because she exhausted all available options.
But in terms of Gaza and Israel, if the people of Gaza came out and attacked military places in Israel, that would make, but they didn't do that. They attacked civilians. And by the, just to keep in mind, we've got 5 minutes left.
Well, I recognize that as a question. I am not dogmatic. So, I'll put the question to you. If Hamas had killed on October 7th, not 850 civilians, and roughly speaking, 300 combatants. If Hamas had only killed combatants, 1,200, let's just say, it just killed combatants. Mr. Hassell, you just came back from Israel. You informed me before the program began. Do you seriously believe, can you possibly believe, that Israel's reaction to the killing of 1,200 combatants would have been less furious
So
then the
what?
fact that, excuse me,
So
do you
what?
believe the reaction would have been less furious than if they killed 800 civilians and 300 combatants? It would have been, that's ridiculous. Israel is a Spartan society. It attaches more value to a combatant's death than a civilian's death. The reaction, not that it's physically possible, but were it physically possible, the reaction would have been 10 times more furious if they had killed 1,200 combatants. Do you seriously believe the international community would have been less supportive of Israel if Hamas had killed 1,200 combatants? I think that's ridiculous. It's not believable. So
my question isn't on what Israel's response is. It's more on your example, and your example is more, taking out the target. And wouldn't, if Gaza want to do that, right? Wouldn't they actually target military targets, which might help them?
No.
What's the point of killing civilians?
Well, the point of committing civilians is very simple: to transmit the message to Israel. If you are going to murder our civilians, we're going to murder yours. If our civilians aren't safe, your civilians aren't safe. If you're going to periodically commit high-tech killing sprees in Gaza at your whim, well, we're going to commit low-tech, very low-tech as it happened, low-tech killing sprees in Israel. So my view is, when I thought through the whole matter, I thought the most compelling statement, you'll find it in that introduction. If you look back at the text, there is a quote I give from what was called the New York Working Men's Party. Okay, it's indented in smaller font. Okay, I'd like you to read. Now, the New York Working Men's Party described the Nat Turner Rebellion, the rebellion of the African American slaves in 1831, led by Nat Turner. The New York Working Men's Party said it was an unjustifiable atrocity. An unjustifiable atrocity. We're not going to try to justify it. The atrocities that occurred in October during the Nat Turner revolt were unjustifiable. You can't justify them. I agree with that regarding October 7th. They're unjustified. You can't justify them. But then what did they go on to say? They said, what were they guilty of? Were they out to plunder, steal? No. They wanted to be free.
Mm-hmm.
And in their minds, the only way they could be free was to indiscriminately, notice the word, to indiscriminately kill that whole race of people who they justifiably believe were the source of their torment and agony in life. And in my opinion, that's the correct moral balance. The atrocities, they can't be justified. But the belief that the only way that the people of Gaza could end their torment and acquire their God-given right to freedom, the only way they could attain that goal was to, quote, indiscriminately kill the race of people who they justifiably believed were responsible for their torment. I think that's an accurate depiction of the Nat Turner Rebellion, or I should say an accurate moral judgment on the Nat Turner Rebellion, and it's a correct moral judgment on October 7th. They justifiably believed that the only way to free themselves from this torment, this 70-year torment, was to indiscriminately kill the whole of that race, which they, to quote the New York Working Men's Party, justifiably believed was responsible for their enslavement.
I believe you have to go now, so I'm going to thank you for joining.